It was a Tuesday night in Memphis, Tennessee. The year was 1965. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of southern heat that clings to your skin even after the sun goes down. Inside a small rhythm and blues club on the south side of the city, about 40 people sat scattered across wooden chairs, nursing drinks and waiting for the music to start. They had no idea what they were about to witness. Because tonight, two men were about to share the same stage. Two men who represented two completely different philosophies of what it meant to sing the blues. One believed that true artistry was control, discipline, the ability to whisper a lyric and make an entire room lean forward to hear it. The other believed that music was not something you controlled. It was something that controlled you. Something that grabbed your chest and tore its way out whether you were ready or not. One of those men had just gone on national radio and called the other a screaming amateur, and in about 3 hours, both of them would be standing under the same spotlight. But before we get to that night, we need to go back. We need to understand how a boy from the cotton fields of Georgia became the most electrifying performer in American music, and we need to understand why a man from the streets of Memphis thought he could stop him. Otis Redding Jr. was born on September 9, 1941, in Dawson, Georgia. Not even in Dawson, really. About 7 miles south of town, on a sharecropping plantation where his family worked the same red Georgia dirt that their parents had worked before them. Have you ever been so poor that the idea of dreaming felt like a luxury you could not afford? That was Otis Redding's childhood. When Otis was 3, the family moved to Macon, Georgia, into Tyndall Heights, a public housing project home to hundreds of black families trying to survive in the segregated South. His father found work at Robins Air Force Base. His mother cleaned houses and sold Avon products door to door. They were not starving, but they were close enough to see it from where they stood. Otis started singing almost before he could talk. By 5, he was in the choir at Vineville Baptist Church, his small voice cutting through the congregation like something that did not belong in a child's body. By 10, he was taking drum and singing lessons, absorbing everything he could about music. Every Sunday, he earned $6 performing gospel songs on the local radio station in Macon. $6. For a black kid in 1950s Georgia, that was not pocket money. That was survival. That was bread on the table and shoes on his feet. His father, Otis Sr., preached in local churches on Sundays and worked himself to the bone every other day. His mother, Fannie Mae, never stopped moving, cleaning other people's houses during the day and coming home to clean her own at night. They were the kind of parents who loved their children fiercely but could not protect them from the one thing that hurt the most: poverty. The slow, grinding, relentless kind that does not kill you all at once. It kills you a little bit every day. But here is the part that changed everything. When Otis was 15, his father got sick. Tuberculosis. The disease that had been stalking black communities in the South for generations. Otis Sr. was in and out of the hospital, unable to work, and the medical bills piled up like stones on a man already drowning. The kind of sickness that does not just attack your body, it attacks your family's ability to eat, to pay rent, to keep the lights on. Otis made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He dropped out of Ballard Hudson High School in the 10th grade. Not because he was lazy, not because he did not care about education, because his mother could not do it alone, because his brothers and sisters needed food, because somebody had to step up, and at 15 years old, Otis decided that somebody was him. So Otis dug wells. He pumped gas. He worked as a roofer. And he took whatever job would hire a 15-year-old black kid in Macon, Georgia in the 1950s. And at night, after the work was done, after his hands were raw and his back ached, he sang. He sang in talent shows at the Douglas Theater. He sang Little Richard songs because Little Richard was from Macon, too. And if Little Richard could make it out of this town, maybe there was hope. He won the talent show 15 weeks in a row, 15 consecutive victories. They eventually banned him from competing because it was not fair to the other contestants. Think about that. a teenager so talented they had to disqualify him because nobody else stood a chance. But winning a local talent contest and making a living from music are two very different things. And in the early 1960s, for a black musician in the American South, yes, the path from one to the other was paved with humiliation, rejection, and doors that slammed shut before you could even open your mouth. Which brings us to Bobby Bland. Robert Calvin Bland was born on January 27, 1930, in Rosemark, Tennessee, just outside Memphis. Like Otis, Bobby grew up poor. Like Otis, he found his voice in the church. But that is where the similarities end. Bobby moved to Memphis at 17 and dove headfirst into Beale Street, the center of the blues universe. In the late 1940s, Memphis was a city teeming with musical energy. Every corner of Beale Street had a sound pouring out of it, and every bar had a singer who thought he was going to be the next big thing. Bobby fell in with a group of aspiring musicians that would one day shake the world: B.B. King, Johnny Ace, Junior Parker, Roscoe Gordon. They called themselves the Beale Streeters, and Bobby was right in the middle of it all, learning, absorbing, studying how the masters moved a crowd. But here is what made Bobby different from almost every other blues singer of his generation. Bobby did not scream. He did not shout. He did not throw himself around a stage in a frenzy of sweat and emotion. Bobby Bland whispered. He crooned. He took a lyric and massaged it with his voice until it sounded like velvet draped over a broken heart. His phrasing was conversational, almost intimate, as if he was not singing to an audience of hundreds but confessing to a single person in a dark room. People called him the Sinatra of the blues and the Lion of the blues, and he earned both titles with every perfectly controlled note that left his throat. By the early 1960s, Bobby was one of the biggest names in rhythm and blues, hit after hit on Duke Records, I Pity the Fool, Turn On Your Love Light, 63 singles on the rhythm and blues charts during his career. He was a man who had mastered his craft through discipline and precision, which is exactly why Otis Redding bothered him so much. By 1965, Otis was rising fast. His career had started almost by accident. He had been driving guitarist Johnny Jenkins to a session at Stax Records because Jenkins did not have a license. When the session ended early, Otis was allowed to sing 2 songs with the leftover studio time. The second song was These Arms of Mine. Jim Stewart, the head of Stax, said Otis poured his entire soul into that ballad, and he was right. By 1965, Otis had released Otis Blue. The album critics would call the definitive soul record of its era, and he was doing it in a way that was the exact opposite of Bobby Bland. Where Bobby was controlled, Otis was explosive. Where Bobby whispered, Otis screamed. Where Bobby stood still, Otis threw his entire body into every performance, drenched in sweat, veins bulging in his neck, eyes squeezed shut as if the music was physically tearing through him, and Bobby Bland hated it, publicly, on the radio. It was autumn 1965. Bobby was doing a promotional interview at a Memphis radio station. The host asked what he thought about the new generation of soul singers from Stax Records. Bobby paused. Then he said something that echoed through the Memphis music world like a gunshot. He said Otis Redding was not a singer. He was a screamer. He said there was no craft in screaming. Any man on the street could scream. He said he wanted a singer who could whisper and make you cry. That was real artistry. And then he called Otis Redding a screaming amateur. The words hit the Memphis music scene like a bomb. Within hours, everyone who mattered had heard it. And Otis Redding, driving between gigs on a highway in Mississippi, heard it on his car radio. He pulled the car to the side of the road. He sat there for a long time, the engine running, Bobby Bland's voice still hanging in the air. Most people would have fired back. Most people would have let anger turn into words. Otis did not say a word. He put the car back in drive and kept going. But inside, something was building. Not anger, something deeper. The feeling of being underestimated by someone who should have known better. The feeling of being dismissed by someone who had never watched him sing live, because fate had already written the punchline. Both men were booked at the same Memphis club the following Saturday night. Bobby was the headliner. Otis was the opening act. The news spread through Memphis like wildfire. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when the screaming amateur had to stand on the same stage as the man who had publicly humiliated him. Saturday arrived. The club was packed. Musicians from across Memphis showed up. Stax people, Duke Records people, radio disc jockeys. Everyone wanted to witness this. Bobby arrived first, dressed impeccably, suit pressed, shoes polished, the easy confidence of a man who had been doing this for 2 decades. Otis arrived about an hour before his set, quieter than usual. He sat in a corner backstage, but not speaking, not warming up, just sitting with his eyes closed as if listening to something nobody else could hear. At 9:00, the opening act was introduced. Otis walked out under the lights. Simple suit, no flashy jewelry. Just Otis, a microphone, and the band behind him. And Bobby Bland himself appeared at the back of the room. He leaned against the bar, arms crossed, drink in hand, the posture of a man about to be entertained by something beneath him. Their eyes met across the room for just a moment. Then Otis did something that surprised everyone. He did not start with a screamer. He started slow, quiet, almost a whisper. He began with "These Arms of Mine," his voice barely above a murmur, so soft that the entire club had to lean forward to hear. He sang it like he was back in that Stax studio in 1962. A nobody driver who had been given 30 minutes of leftover time and had poured his entire broken, beautiful soul into a microphone. The room went still. This was not screaming. This was a man reaching into the deepest part of himself and pulling out something so raw, so honest, so impossibly vulnerable that it hurt to listen to. His voice trembled. It cracked. It soared. Each note carried the weight of every cotton field his family had worked, every well he had dug, every door slammed in his face. At the bar, Bobby Bland's arms slowly uncrossed. Otis finished the ballad. The silence lasted 3 seconds before the applause erupted. Not polite clapping, the kind that comes from people who have just witnessed something unexpected. But Otis was not done. He transitioned into faster numbers. Each song built on the one before, as the energy climbing, his body moving with the music, his hands gripping the microphone stand like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. By the 4th song, the front row was on their feet. By the 5th, the whole club was standing. By the 6th, Otis was drenched in sweat, his voice filling every corner with a force that was not just sound. It was presence. It was truth. He did not scream, not the way Bobby had described. What Otis did was testify. Like a preacher in a church, like a man possessed by something holy, he took every ounce of pain and joy and defiance in his 24-year-old body and channeled it through his voice until the room could not contain it. For 45 minutes, Otis dismantled every word Bobby Bland had said, not with arguments, with music. When he finished, the crowd erupted, screaming, stomping, and banging on tables, the loudest ovation in 20 years. Then it was Bobby Bland's turn. Bobby walked to the stage with professional composure. His voice was impeccable. His phrasing was flawless. His band was tight. But the energy was different. The fire Otis had lit was still burning, and Bobby's cool, measured approach felt like someone trying to have a quiet conversation in a house already on fire. Bobby was not bad. He was brilliant, as always. But on that night, after what they had witnessed, his brilliance felt like bringing a candle to a room lit by lightning. Bobby finished his set. The applause was respectful, professional, the kind you give to a man you admire but who has not just shattered your understanding of what music can do. Bobby stood at the bar afterward, holding a drink he had barely touched, as the ice had long since melted. He stood there for a long time, watching the empty stage. Then he finished his drink in one swallow and said something that people who were there that night would repeat for years. I called him an amateur. He made me look like one." That night did not end the story. It began a new chapter. Otis's career accelerated beyond anything anyone predicted. He released The Dictionary of Soul in 1966. He toured Europe and was crowned world's #1 vocalist by Melody Maker magazine, an honor that had belonged to Elvis Presley for the previous 10 years. And then came June 17, 1967, Monterey, California. The Monterey International Pop Festival was rock royalty. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, Simon and Garfunkel, Ravi Shankar, the Mamas and the Papas. The audience was overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly young, and overwhelmingly unfamiliar with soul music. Otis was the only soul act on the bill. He was there because Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records had pushed hard to get him included, seeing it as an opportunity to introduce Otis to a massive new audience. But backstage, there were doubts. Some people privately called it a white person's festival. Some wondered if a black soul singer from Georgia could connect with a crowd that had come to see psychedelic rock and folk music. Otis did not share those doubts. When he took the stage, backed by Booker T and the MGs in matching lime green suits, he looked out at a sea of faces that looked nothing like his usual audiences. And he did not adjust. He did not tone himself down. He did not try to fit into their world. He made them come into his. He told the crowd this was the love crowd. He asked if they all loved each other. They roared back, yes. And when he closed with "Try a Little Tenderness," what happened was not a performance. It was a transformation. He started slow, tender, then the song built, the horns kicked in, the drums drove harder, his voice climbing until it was shaking the very air. When it was over, the crowd did not just stand. They screamed. By virtually every account, it was the single greatest performance in the history of the Monterey Pop Festival. The screaming amateur had just conquered the most important rock festival in history. But the story does not end at Monterey. After the festival, Otis was changing. The explosive energy was still there, but something new was emerging. A quietness, a reflectiveness. He spent time on his houseboat in Sausalito, California, sitting on the dock, watching ships come and go, working on a new song. It was unlike anything he had ever written. Gentle, contemplative, and at the end, where his voice would normally soar into an explosive crescendo, there was instead a simple, lonely whistle trailing off into silence. The song was "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay." He recorded it on December 7, 1967, with Steve Cropper at Stax Studios. He told people it was the greatest song he had ever written. 3 days later, on December 10th, Otis boarded a small twin-engine plane with members of his band. They were flying to a concert in Madison, Wisconsin. The weather was bad. Fog. Rain. The plane crashed into the icy waters of Lake Monona. Everyone on board was killed except one. Otis Ray Redding Jr. was 26 years old. He never heard the final version of "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay." He never saw it climb to #1, making it the first posthumous #1 single in history. He never saw it sell millions of copies around the world. He never saw it become one of the most beloved songs ever recorded. He never saw the world he was about to conquer finally open its arms to embrace him. The boy from Dawson, Georgia, who dug wells and pumped gas and sang in church and won every talent show and dropped out of school to feed his family and poured his entire soul into a microphone every single time he opened his mouth, was gone. 26 years old. An entire universe of music still inside him, unsung, unwritten, unheard. Bobby Bland lived to be 83, and he continued performing and recording for decades after that night in Memphis. He was inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame in 1981 and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1992. He received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1997. He was, by every measure, one of the greatest blues singers who ever lived. But Bobby never forgot that night. Years later, in an interview, when Otis Redding's name came up, Bobby went quiet. Then he said something people who knew him never expected from a man as proud as Bobby Bland. He said he had spent his whole career learning how to control his voice, and Otis had spent his learning how to set it free. And setting it free was harder. That is the story of the screaming amateur and the lion of the blues. A story about two men, two voices, two philosophies, and one night in Memphis that proved something every artist, every creator, every person who has ever been told they are not good enough needs to hear. Control is a skill, but freedom is a gift. Bobby Bland taught us how to whisper. Otis Redding taught us how to burn. And on that Saturday night in a small club in Memphis, the fire won. Otis Redding's music has been streamed billions of times. His songs have appeared in hundreds of films and television shows. Rolling Stone magazine ranked him number 21 on their list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. A 7-foot statue of Otis stands in Gateway Park in Macon, Georgia, the city where a 15-year-old boy dropped out of school because his family needed him to survive more than they needed him to graduate. Somewhere, right now, someone is listening to Otis Redding for the first time, and they are feeling something they cannot explain, a tightness in their chest, a heat behind their eyes, a sensation that this raw, unpolished, impossibly powerful voice is speaking directly to something buried deep inside them. That is the legacy of the screaming amateur. Not control, not polish. Truth. The kind of truth that Bobby Bland heard that night at the bar, with his arms slowly uncrossing and his drink slowly melting, watching a kid from Georgia do something that all his decades of mastery could never quite do. Set a room on fire with nothing but his voice. If this story moved you, if Otis Redding's courage reminded you that your voice matters even when the world tells you it does not, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that being raw and real is not a weakness, it is a superpower. Tell us in the comments about a time someone underestimated you and you proved them wrong. Not with words, with action. And ring that notification bell so you never miss another story about the legends who changed music forever.